The diplomatic station floated in the darkness of space, a massive structure of crystal and metal that sparkled against the void. Inside its main chamber, Ambassador Dae-hyun sat at the long negotiation table, his face calm despite the tension that filled the room. To his left sat Admiral Tae-won, a veteran of 30 years in the fleet, his military uniform perfectly pressed. To his right was Dr. Ji-woo, a scientist who specialized in alien biology and had spent her entire career studying the species that now surrounded them. Across the table sat the representatives of the Galactic Council. The Vextar were tall reptilian creatures with scales that shifted colors based on their emotions. Their leader, Velthun, watched the humans with cold yellow eyes that had seen centuries pass. Beside him sat the Hravkan ambassador, an insectoid being whose chittering language was translated by machines into words the humans could understand. The third council member was a luminar, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline form that glowed with an eerie blue light. Dae-hyun had been a diplomat for 20 years. He had negotiated trade deals, settled territorial disputes, and built bridges between cultures, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this moment. The council had called this meeting under the pretense of discussing humanity's expansion into neighboring systems. Dae-hyun had arrived expecting difficult negotiations. What he received instead was an ultimatum. Velthun spoke first, his voice deep and resonant. The translation came through clearly. Humanity would surrender 60% of their controlled systems immediately. They would submit to what the council called genetic optimization, a polite term for forced sterilization of populations the council deemed unsuitable. Humans would accept permanent second-class citizenship within the galactic community, with no voting rights and no representation. Finally, humanity would dismantle 90% of their military forces and submit the remainder to council oversight. The words hung in the air like poison. Ji-woo's hand tightened on her datapad, her knuckles turning white. Tae-won's jaw clenched, but his expression remained neutral. Dae-hyun simply listened, his breathing steady and controlled. Velthun continued speaking, explaining the council's reasoning with the cold logic of someone who had made this speech before. Humans bred too quickly, he said. They expanded too aggressively. They consumed too many resources. In the 10,000 years the council had maintained galactic peace, they had encountered this problem 3 times before. 3 other young species who grew too fast, who wanted too much, who threatened the established order. Each time the council had taken action. Each time the problem had been solved. The reptilian leaned forward, his scales shifting to a darker shade. Humanity was a pest species, he explained. Left unchecked, they would become a threat to every established civilization in the galaxy. The council was offering mercy by allowing humanity to continue existing at all. They could have simply exterminated every human world, but they were not monsters. They were being generous. Dae-hyun listened to every word. He watched Velthun's body language, noted the casual cruelty in the Hravkan's chittering, observed the Luminar's pulsing energy that indicated agreement with everything being said. These beings had already made their decision. This was not a negotiation. This was a sentencing. When Velthun finished speaking, silence filled the chamber. The council members waited for humanity's response, confident in their position. Their combined military forces outnumbered humanity, 200 to 1. They had weapons that could crack planets, technology that humanity was still decades away from understanding, and the experience of ruling the galaxy for millennia. What could these young upstarts possibly do except surrender? Dae-hyun stood slowly. He straightened his jacket and looked each council member in the eye. When he spoke, his voice was calm and measured. He thanked them for their clarity and their honesty. He told them that humanity needed time to consult with Earth, to discuss these terms with their government and their people. He requested 72 hours. Velthun's scales rippled with what might have been amusement. The council conferred briefly among themselves, their conversation a mixture of hisses, clicks, and pulses of light. Then Velthun turned back to the humans and agreed. 72 hours. The council was not unreasonable after all. They understood that humanity needed time to accept reality. The meeting adjourned. Dae-hyun, Tae-won, and Ji-woo gathered their materials and walked toward the exit. Their faces revealed nothing, their movements professional and controlled. But inside, each of them felt the weight of what had just occurred. As they walked through the corridor toward their shuttle, Ji-woo's translator picked up a conversation from the council chamber they had just left. She stopped walking, listening to the device. The council members were still talking, their voices relaxed now that the humans were gone. They were discussing how to divide human territory among themselves. The Vextar wanted the industrial worlds. The Hravkan claimed the agricultural planets. The Luminar desired the system's rich and exotic energy sources. They were already carving up humanity's empire like vultures over a corpse. The peace talks had been theater, nothing more. The council had made their decision before the humans ever arrived. Jiwoo shared what she had heard with Daehyun and Taiwan once they were safely aboard their shuttle. The three of them sat in silence as the small craft accelerated away from the diplomatic station, heading for the jump point that would take them back to human space. Taiwan spoke first, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. They had known the council was arrogant, but this level of contempt was something else entirely. To not even pretend to negotiate, to simply dictate terms and then discuss the spoils while the humans were still in the building. Daehyun stared out the viewport at the stars. He had spent his entire career believing that diplomacy could solve any problem, that rational beings could always find common ground. The council had just taught him a harsh lesson. Some beings did not want common ground. Some beings only understood power. Jiwoo was already working on her data pad, pulling up files about the three species the council had mentioned, the ones who had been dealt with before. She found references in the historical databases, but the details were scarce. Species rendered extinct or reduced to tiny populations living under council control. Entire civilizations erased or neutered because they had grown too successful, too quickly. The shuttle reached the jump point and disappeared into hyperspace, leaving the diplomatic station behind. Aboard that small craft, three humans carried a message that would change the galaxy. The council had declared war, even if they did not yet realize it. And humanity would have to decide how to respond. Daehyun activated the encrypted communication system and began composing his report to Earth. He chose his words carefully, knowing that what he wrote would influence the greatest decision humanity had ever faced: submit to extinction or fight against impossible odds. But deep down, he already knew what the answer would be. Humans had not crawled out of caves, survived ice ages, conquered their own violent nature, and reached for the stars just to bow before arrogant aliens who saw them as pests. 73 years ago, humanity had joined the galactic community in hope and optimism. Now they would show the galaxy what humans became when hope was taken away. The message sent, Daehyun closed his eyes and prepared for what was coming. The council wanted to see humanity bow. They were about to learn that humans only knelt to pray before battle. 3 kilometers beneath the Pacific Ocean, in a facility that officially did not exist, Fleet Admiral Hyo-jin stood before a holographic display showing the strategic situation. The room was filled with humanity's top military and civilian leadership, their faces grim as they processed what Ambassador Daehyun had reported. President Haewon sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable. Hyo-jin had commanded fleets for 40 years. She had overseen humanity's expansion into space, coordinated the construction of orbital defenses, and trained the officers who now commanded ships across dozens of systems. She was a tall woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much combat. Before joining the unified Earth fleet, she had fought in the Unification Wars, the brutal conflict that had nearly destroyed humanity before first contact with the aliens. That war was humanity's greatest secret. When the Galactic Council had made first contact 73 years ago, they had found a united humanity presenting a peaceful front to the galaxy. What they did not know was that just 5 years before, humans had been killing each other by the millions. The Unification Wars had lasted 40 years, devastating entire continents and pushing humanity to the brink of extinction. Nuclear weapons, biological agents, kinetic strikes from orbit, all of it had been used in humanity's desperate struggle to either unite or destroy itself. In the end, unity had won, but barely. The survivors had looked at the ashes of their civilization and made a choice. They buried the evidence of their self-destruction, destroyed the records of their worst weapons, and vowed to present a united, peaceful face to whatever they might find in the galaxy. When the council arrived, they saw exactly what humanity wanted them to see. A young species, barely spacefaring, eager to learn and cooperate. Now Captain Sang-hoon of military intelligence stood before the assembled leaders and revealed what humanity had hidden. He activated a series of displays showing weapon systems, fleet positions, and research facilities that existed in the darkest corners of human space. The Council believed humanity had perhaps 5,000 combat-capable ships. They were wrong. The Ghost Fleet consisted of 4,000 warships built in secret shipyards hidden in the Oort cloud, far beyond where Council sensors ever looked. These ships had been under construction for 30 years, crewed by volunteers who had lived their entire adult lives in isolation, training and preparing for a war they hoped would never come. They used technology that humanity had officially abandoned, weapons banned by treaty but never actually destroyed. Sang-hoon explained the Widowmaker Doctrine, a strategic plan developed during the darkest days of the Unification Wars. It outlined every weapon system humanity had ever created, including those considered too terrible to use. Kinetic kill satellites that could turn orbital mechanics into weapons of mass destruction, viral agents engineered to target specific genetic markers, nano-plague swarms that could consume entire ships from the inside out. All of it had been preserved, hidden away against the day it might be needed. Then there was Project Dying Sun. Dr. Yoon Seo, a physicist who looked far too young to be discussing weapons of such magnitude, presented the research. Her team had been working for 20 years on stellar manipulation technology, officially for mining purposes. In reality, they had developed a way to destabilize stars, forcing them into premature collapse. It had never been tested on a real star, but the simulations were clear. Humanity could kill suns. Colonel Bo-Ra represented the Strategic Deep Strike Division, an elite force of 10,000 soldiers who trained for one purpose: decapitation strikes against enemy leadership. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were hunters, trained in every form of combat humanity had ever developed. They could infiltrate alien worlds, eliminate high-value targets, and disappear before anyone knew they were there. Bo-Ra herself had spent 15 years training for missions she prayed she would never undertake. The briefing continued for 3 hours. Each revelation was more shocking than the last. Humanity had not been idle during their time in the galactic community. While presenting a peaceful, cooperative face to the Council, they had been preparing for the possibility of conflict. They had studied Council military doctrine, identified weaknesses, and developed countermeasures. They had assumed, hoped even, that such preparation would never be necessary. When the briefing finished, silence filled the underground chamber. President Hai Wan looked at each person present, reading the weight of the decision in their faces. Dr. Yoon Seo was the first to speak, her voice trembling slightly. There had to be another way, she argued. Surely they could negotiate, find some compromise. The cost of war would be terrible for both sides. Captain Ki-jun from Signals Intelligence responded by playing intercepted Council communications. His team had been monitoring Council transmissions for years, a clear violation of diplomatic protocols but deemed necessary for security. The messages he played were damning. The Council had already issued cleansing protocols for 23 human worlds. Military forces were being positioned for strikes that would begin in 14 days. The peace talks had been pure theater. The Council had decided to exterminate humanity weeks ago. More intercepted messages followed. Council species were already dividing human territory among themselves. Military commanders discussed acceptable casualties, meaning how many Council soldiers they were willing to lose in the extermination campaign. Economic ministers calculated the profits from human worlds once the current inhabitants were removed. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of compromise. The Council had sentenced humanity to death. Admiral Hyo-jin stood and walked to the holographic display. She manipulated the controls, showing the comparative military strengths. The Council outnumbered humanity 200 to 1 in conventional forces. Their technology was superior in many areas. They had experience maintaining galactic order for thousands of years. By every logical measure, humanity should surrender. But Hyo-jin had fought in the Unification Wars. She had seen what humans could do when their survival was at stake. She had witnessed the creativity of desperation, the innovation born from necessity, the absolute refusal to quit that defined humanity at its core. The Council thought they were dealing with a young, weak species. They were wrong. She spoke then, her voice filling the chamber with certainty. Humanity had not survived the Ice Ages, the plagues, the world wars, and their own self-destructive nature by surrendering when the odds were against them. Humans had always been at their most dangerous when cornered. The council was about to learn what happened when you backed humanity into a corner with no way out. The vote was called. Every person in that room knew what they were deciding. War against an enemy that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and had ruled the galaxy for millennia. The alternative was submission to genetic cleansing, the slow extinction of everything that made them human. One by one they voted. The result was unanimous. Humanity would not submit, they would fight. And if they were going to die, they would make the galaxy remember them. Admiral Hyojin began issuing orders immediately. The Ghost Fleet would be activated and moved into position. Strike teams would be deployed to staging areas near Council space. Research teams would begin final preparations on weapon systems that had only existed in theory. The Widowmaker Doctrine would be implemented in full. President Haiwan composed a message for Ambassador Daehyun. It was brief and to the point. He was to return to the diplomatic station and deliver humanity's response. The message included specific talking points, but she knew Daehyun would find his own words. He had earned that right. As the meeting broke up and leaders hurried to their respective commands, Colonel Bo-Ra remained behind. She approached Admiral Hyojin privately, her face troubled. She asked the question that others were thinking but afraid to voice. If they did this, if they used every terrible weapon humanity had created, what would they become? Hyojin considered the question seriously. She had asked herself the same thing many times over the years. Her answer was honest and brutal. They would become whatever they needed to be to survive. The Council wanted to exterminate them for being successful, for expanding, for doing what every species tried to do. If humanity had to become monsters to survive monsters, then so be it. But she added one more thing, her voice softer. After the war, if they survived, they would have to remember who they had been. They would have to find their way back to the people who had reached for the stars in hope, rather than fear. That would be the real challenge. Not winning the war, but remaining human after it was over. Bora nodded and left to brief her teams. Throughout human space, orders were being transmitted, forces mobilized, weapons prepared. The Council had given them 72 hours to respond. Humanity would use every second of that time to prepare for a war that would reshape the galaxy. In her office, President Haiwan looked at the night sky through the reinforced windows. Somewhere out there, the Council was preparing to destroy everything humanity had built. They thought they were dealing with primitives, with children who would cry and beg when threatened. They were about to discover their mistake. Humanity had learned long ago that the universe did not care about fairness or justice. It did not reward the moral or punish the cruel. It simply existed, indifferent to the struggles of those within it. But humans had also learned that they could make the universe care through sheer force of will. They had bent nature to their purposes, conquered their own world, and reached for the stars. Now the galaxy would learn what humans had known for millennia. When you corner a predator, it does not surrender. It fights with everything it has. And humanity had been the apex predator of Earth long before they ever left it. The shuttle docked with the diplomatic station exactly 72 hours after it had departed. Ambassador Daehyun walked through the corridors with the same calm demeanor he had shown during the first meeting. But something had changed in his eyes. Admiral Taewan and Dr. Jiwoo followed behind him, their faces blank masks that revealed nothing. The council chamber was already full when they arrived. Velthun sat in his position, his scales showing colors that indicated satisfaction and anticipation. The Hravkan ambassador chittered quietly. The sound translated as pleasant conversation about the weather. The luminar pulsed with a steady blue light that suggested contentment. Around them, other council representatives had gathered to witness humanity's surrender. This would be a historic moment after all, the newest member of the galactic community accepting their proper place. Daehyun took his seat at the negotiation table. He placed a small datapad in front of him but did not immediately reference it. Instead, he looked at each council member in turn, his gaze steady and unflinching. The room fell silent as everyone waited for him to speak. Velthun broke the silence first, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. He welcomed the human delegation back and expressed his hope that they had used their time wisely. The council was prepared to hear humanity's acceptance of the terms. Once the formalities were complete, implementation could begin immediately. He spoke as if the outcome was already decided. as if humanity's response was merely a procedural requirement. Dae-hyun stood slowly. He ignored the datapad completely. What he was about to say had been memorized, practiced, and refined during the long journey back to the station. These words would echo through history, and he wanted them to be perfect. He began by thanking the council for their clarity. There was no sarcasm in his voice, no obvious anger. He genuinely appreciated that they had been honest about their intentions. It made humanity's response much simpler. Then he told them a story. For 300,000 years, he explained, humanity had survived on a world that actively tried to kill them. Earth was what xenobiologists called a death world, a planet where the environment itself was hostile to life, ice ages that lasted millennia, volcanic eruptions that blocked out the sun for years, diseases that killed half the population, predators that hunted humans for food. Humans had not just survived these challenges but had thrived despite them. He spoke about human history, about the wars they had fought against each other, conflicts so brutal that they had threatened to render the species extinct. He described weapons that could level cities, plagues engineered to target specific populations, technology designed solely to kill more efficiently. Humans had weaponized everything from simple stones to the fundamental forces of nature itself. They had looked into the abyss of their own destruction and had pulled themselves back from the edge. The council members shifted uncomfortably. This was not the response they had expected. Velthun's scales rippled with irritation. He interrupted, demanding that Dae-hyun get to the point. Would humanity accept the council's terms or not? Dae-hyun smiled then, and it was not a pleasant expression. He explained that the council had made a critical error in their assessment of humanity. They had looked at humans and seen a young species, barely a century off their homeworld. They had seen primitives who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve. They had mistaken humanity's cooperation for weakness and their mercy for submission. Humans had come to the galactic community in peace, he continued. They had followed council laws, respected council traditions, and played by council rules. They had done everything asked of them, and the council's response to this good faith effort was to decide that humanity should be exterminated simply for being successful. The room was completely silent now. Every being present was focused on the human standing before them, speaking words that no one had expected to hear. Dae-hyun's voice grew colder as he delivered humanity's reply. It was simple and direct. No, humanity would not surrender their worlds. They would not submit to genetic cleansing. They would not accept second-class citizenship. They would not dismantle their military. The answer to every demand was no. Velthun stood abruptly, his scales flashing red with anger. He demanded to know if Dae-hyun understood the situation. The council outnumbered humanity 200 to 1. They had weapons that could crack planets. They had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. Humanity was outmatched in every possible way. To refuse was suicide. Dae-hyun nodded, acknowledging the numbers. Then he made humanity's counteroffer. The council had 48 hours to withdraw their ultimatum and return their forces to their core systems. Every council member species would pull back to defensive positions and would never threaten humanity again. This was not a negotiation. This was humanity's only offer. The chamber erupted in chaos. Council members hissed, chittered, and pulsed with colors that indicated shock and outrage. Velthun's voice rose above the noise, demanding to know what possible leverage humanity thought they had. What could these primitives do against the combined might of the Galactic Council? Dae-hyun waited for the noise to die down. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the chamber. He reminded them that humans were the only species in the galaxy that had hunted their planet's apex predators not for survival, but for sport. Humans had looked at the most dangerous creatures on Earth and decided that killing them was entertainment. He explained that humans had weaponized every single element on the periodic table solely for the purpose of killing other humans more efficiently. They had turned physics, chemistry, biology, and mathematics into tools of destruction. They had studied war as both an art and a science for thousands of years. Every human child learned about ancient conflicts, studied the strategies of generals long dead, and understood the cost of combat. The Council, he noted, had not fought a peer conflict in 8,000 years. They had only ever pacified primitives who could not fight back effectively. They had grown comfortable, complacent in their superiority. They had forgotten what real war looked like. Daehyun leaned forward, his hands on the table. If the Council chose to proceed with their plans, humanity would remind the galaxy why humans were dangerous. They would burn Council worlds to ash. They would crack their planets. They would extinguish their suns. Every system the Council controlled would become a battlefield. Every world would become a target. Humanity would not merely fight for survival. They would fight for extinction. Theirs or the Council's, and when it was over, when the Council's children looked at the ruins of their civilization and asked who had done this, the answer would be simple. The Council did this. They woke up the humans. They cornered a species that had spent millennia learning how to kill and gave them no choice but to use that knowledge. Velthun stepped forward, his body language aggressive. He declared this to be an act of war. The Council would crush humanity and make an example of them that would last for millennia. No species would ever dare challenge Council authority again. Daehyun picked up his datapad and turned to leave. He paused at the doorway and looked back one final time. He told them that humanity had not wanted this war. They had come to the galaxy seeking friendship, knowledge, and peace. The Council had chosen to respond with threats of genocide. Now they would learn what humans became when their peaceful overtures were met with violence. The three humans walked out of the chamber, leaving chaos behind them. Council members were shouting at each other, demanding action, calling for military commanders. Velthun was already issuing orders for fleet mobilization. As Daehyun reached the shuttle bay, he activated his encrypted communicator. The message he sent was brief, consisting of only 2 code words that would launch protocols developed over decades of secret preparation, Ragnarok and Prometheus. The first was a reference to ancient human mythology, the end of the world. The second was the name of the Titan who brought fire to humanity. The message was received across human space within seconds. In hidden shipyards in the Oort cloud, 4,000 warships powered up their reactors. On Earth, in bases hidden beneath oceans and mountains, elite strike teams received their deployment orders. In research facilities that officially did not exist, scientists armed weapons that had been designed but never used. Throughout human space, millions of soldiers, sailors, and support personnel began final preparations for a war that would determine whether humanity survived or disappeared from the galaxy. Aboard the shuttle, Daehyun sat in silence as they accelerated away from the diplomatic station. Taiwan asked him if he thought the Council would back down. Daehyun shook his head. The Council's arrogance would not allow them to retreat from threats made by what they considered primitives. They would come with everything they had, confident in their superiority and their numbers. Jiwoo was accessing tactical data on her pad, reviewing the defensive positions of Council fleets. She noted that they were already moving into attack formations, preparing for strikes against human worlds. The Council was not going to wait 48 hours. They would attack as soon as their forces were in position. Daehyun had expected this. The Council had never intended to give humanity a choice. They had decided on genocide and were merely going through the motions of diplomacy to justify their actions to themselves. It made what was about to happen simpler in some ways. There would be no moral ambiguity, no questions about whether humanity was justified in their response. The shuttle jumped to hyperspace, leaving the diplomatic station and the Galactic Council behind. Ahead lay the most destructive war the galaxy had ever witnessed. Behind lay the last moment when peace had been possible. Ambassador Daehyun closed his eyes and prayed to gods he was not sure he believed in that humanity would survive what was coming. But he also prayed that if humanity did survive, they would remember who they had been before the war, because he knew that the things they were about to do would change them forever. The Council wanted to destroy humanity for being successful. Instead, they were about to transform humanity into something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The war began not with a dramatic battle but with silence. Across 47 Council-controlled systems, military communication networks simply stopped working. Command stations lost contact with their fleets. Admirals found themselves unable to coordinate with their subordinates. The vast communication infrastructure that the Council had relied on for thousands of years went dark in a matter of minutes. Major Sung-ho stood on the bridge of the Ghost Fleet flagship, watching the tactical display as his battle group emerged from hyperspace deep inside Vextar core territory. The Council had believed their hyperspace routes were secure, protected by encryption that would take decades to break. They had not accounted for humanity's experience with code breaking during their own wars. Human cryptographers had cracked the Council's navigation codes 3 years ago and had been quietly mapping hidden routes ever since. Their ghost fleet consisted of ships built using technology that officially did not exist, powered by reactors that supposedly could not be made stable, armed with weapons that should not have been possible. Each ship was crewed by men and women who had spent decades training in secret, preparing for a war they hoped would never come. Now that war was here, and they were ready. Sung-Ho's battle group struck the first Council military installation with precision that shocked the defenders. Vextar warships scrambled to respond, but they were designed for different types of combat. Council warfare was ritualized, almost ceremonial. Fleets met in open space, exchanged fire at respectful distances, and fought according to established conventions that minimized casualties and damage. Humans fought differently. They had learned warfare in the brutal school of total war, where the only rule was survival and every advantage was exploited. Sung-Ho's ships did not engage in honorable combat. They struck from multiple vectors simultaneously, targeting power systems and life support rather than shields. They used kinetic weapons that Council sensors were not calibrated to detect. Tungsten rods accelerated to nearly light speed that punched through shields designed to disperse energy weapons. The first Vextar battle station died in less than 10 minutes, its shields useless against weapons that relied on simple mass and velocity. The crew never understood what killed them. While Sung-Ho's fleet struck military targets, Colonel Bo-Ra led her teams on a different kind of mission. They materialized on Council homeworlds using stealth insertion techniques that made them invisible to sensors. These were not soldiers marching into battle. They were shadows, ghosts who killed and vanished before anyone knew they were there. Bo-Ra had spent 15 years training for this. She knew the layouts of Council command centers, had studied the security protocols, understood the psychology of her targets. Her team hit the Vextar High Command building 3 hours after the war began. They bypassed security systems using exploits that human hackers had discovered years ago, moved through corridors like water flowing around obstacles, and eliminated 34 admirals before anyone realized what was happening. The Council military command structure collapsed overnight. Officers who had spent centuries in positions of authority suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that did not follow any rules they understood. Humans targeted leadership specifically, treating the war as a series of assassination missions rather than traditional military engagements. Dr. Yunseo watched from her research station as Project Dying Sun moved into its active phase. She had spent 20 years developing this technology, always hoping it would never be used. Now she was preparing to kill a star, to commit genocide on a scale that made her physically ill. But she had seen the intercepted Council communications. She knew what they had planned for humanity. This was not murder. This was survival. The device was deployed in the Hravkan home system, a massive stellar compression array that would force their sun into unstable fusion. The star would not die immediately. The Hravkan would have 300 years to evacuate their homeworld or develop a solution. But the message was clear and terrible. Humanity could kill stars, and they were willing to do it. News of the stellar weapon spread through Council space like wildfire. Species that had been preparing to join the war against humanity suddenly reconsidered. The Luminar Collective, beings of pure energy who considered themselves intellectually superior to all matter-based life, withdrew from the conflict entirely. They had calculated the probabilities and realized that fighting humans might result in the extinction of everyone, including themselves. The tactical situation was unlike anything the Council had experienced. Their 200-to-1 numerical advantage was meaningless when humans refused to fight conventional battles. Ghost fleet ships struck and vanished, using hyperspace routes the Council did not know existed. Strike teams eliminated leadership faster than it could be replaced. Human weapons ignored defenses that had been considered impenetrable for millennia. Captain Minji oversaw the deployment of weapons that humanity had sworn never to use again. Self-replicating nanomachines that consumed ship hulls, turning Council vessels into clouds of metallic dust. Viral agents engineered to target specific alien biologies, designed during the Unification Wars and preserved despite treaties banning such weapons. Quantum-entangled mines that predicted enemy fleet movements and positioned themselves accordingly. Each weapon was worse than the last. Each represented a line that humanity had once drawn and was now crossing. Minji kept a private log, documenting every terrible thing she was ordering done. knowing that if humanity survived, there would need to be a reckoning for these actions. But survival came first. Morality was a luxury for species that were not facing extinction. The Council's military doctrine was based on overwhelming force applied predictably. They massed fleets, advanced on objectives, and crushed resistance through superior numbers and technology. Against primitives who could not adapt, this approach had worked for thousands of years. Against humans, it was suicide. Every concentration of Council ships became a target for weapons that turned mass into a vulnerability. When the Vextar assembled a fleet of 5,000 warships to strike at Earth, humans responded with kinetic kill weapons launched from hidden platforms. The fleet was destroyed before it reached the jump point, shattered by tungsten rods that cost almost nothing to produce but carried enough kinetic energy to crack moons. The Hruvkan tried a different approach, using their superior numbers to attack multiple human systems simultaneously. They believed that forcing humanity to defend on multiple fronts would dilute their forces and create opportunities. Instead, they discovered that humans had prepared for exactly this scenario. Automated defense systems activated in every threatened system. Weapons platforms that had been disguised as civilian infrastructure came online, and reserve forces appeared from hiding places the Council had never detected. Every human world became a fortress. Every system became a death trap. The Council's strategy of overwhelming force ran into defensive preparations that had been decades in the way, making Admiral Hyojin coordinated the overall war effort from her command center beneath the Pacific. She watched the tactical displays with satisfaction mixed with horror. Humanity was winning, but the cost would be paid in the nightmares of everyone involved. The things they were doing, the weapons they were using, the tactics they were employing. All of it was effective and all of it was terrible. She received reports from across human space. Ghost fleet losses were minimal, less than 3%. Council fleet losses exceeded 40% after only 11 days of combat. Strike team operations had eliminated so many senior Council officers that some military formations had collapsed entirely from lack of leadership. The stellar weapon had created panic among Council species, causing several to demand immediate peace negotiations. But Hyojin knew the war was not over. The Council still had vast resources, billions of soldiers, thousands of worlds. They were wounded and shocked, but not defeated. And wounded animals were often more dangerous than healthy ones. Captain Jae-sung received the order he had been dreading. Fleet Admiral Hyojin's message was brief and encrypted. He was to proceed to the Hruvkan home system and activate the final sequence of Project Dying Sun. The stellar compression was currently set to slow destabilization, giving the Hruvkan centuries to evacuate. Hyojin wanted the option to accelerate that process if necessary. Jae-sung looked at his crew, seeing the same conflicted emotions on their faces that he felt. They had all volunteered for this mission knowing what it might require. But knowing in theory and doing in practice were very different things. If they executed this order, they would be directly responsible for the deaths of billions. He gave the order. The device adjusted, increasing the compression rate. The Hruvkan sun would now go critical in 70 years instead of 300. It was still time to evacuate, but barely. The message to the Council was being refined. Push humanity too far, and the timeline would be reduced further. 17 days after the war began, the Luminar Collective formally withdrew from all hostilities. They released a statement to the galactic community explaining their decision. Humans, they said, were willing to destroy the galaxy rather than submit. Fighting them was not a question of military superiority but of mutual survival. The Luminar chose survival. The Vextar and Hruvkan found themselves alone, facing an enemy that had systematically dismantled their military capabilities while suffering minimal losses. Their admirals were dead or in hiding. Their fleets were scattered and demoralized. Their populations were terrified by the prospect of stellar weapons being used against them. Emergency sessions were called in both governments. Leaders who had confidently voted for humanity's extermination now faced the consequences of that decision. Some argued for continued war, claiming that surrender would mean the end of Council authority throughout the galaxy. Others pointed out that Council authority would mean nothing if their species were extinct. On the 20th day of the war, both the Vextar and Hruvkan governments sent simultaneous messages to Earth. They requested an immediate ceasefire and negotiations for a peace settlement. The messages were not the arrogant ultimatums that had started this conflict. They were pleas from species that had suddenly realized they were losing a war they had thought unwinnable for their opponents. Admiral Hyojin read the messages and felt no satisfaction. Humanity had won, but at a cost that would echo through generations. They had used weapons that should never have been created, committed acts that history would judge harshly, and revealed to the galaxy just how dangerous humans could be when their survival was threatened. She sent a response accepting the ceasefire and proposing the same location for negotiations that had hosted the original peace talks, Terminus 9, the diplomatic station where this had all begun. It seemed appropriate that it should also be where it ended. But she knew this war would not truly be over for a long time. The scars it had left on humanity's collective conscience would take generations to heal, and the galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. The diplomatic station at Terminus 9 looked exactly as it had when this began, but everything else had changed. The same crystal corridors reflected light in the same patterns, but now they reflected a different galaxy. Ambassador Daehyun walked those corridors again, but this time he was not arriving as a petitioner hoping for mercy. He was arriving as the representative of a species that had fundamentally altered the balance of galactic power in just 20 days. The council chamber was arranged differently this time. The long negotiation table remained, but the seating had changed. Daehyun sat at the head of the table, flanked by Admiral Taewon and Dr. Jiwoo. Across from them sat what remained of the council leadership. Velthun was not among them. He had died during a strike team operation, killed in his own command center by soldiers he never saw coming. The new Vextar representative was younger, her scales showing colors that indicated fear poorly controlled. The Haravkan representative chittered nervously, the translation coming through as apologies and requests for understanding. The Luminar representative pulsed with muted colors, present to witness but not to participate since their species had withdrawn from the conflict. Around the table sat representatives from dozens of other council species, all of them watching the humans with expressions ranging from fear to awe to hatred. Admiral Taewon stood to present humanity's terms. There was no gloating in his voice, no satisfaction in their victory. He simply laid out the conditions that would govern the post-war galaxy, with the same professional detachment he had shown throughout his career. First, the Council would immediately dismantle all cleansing protocols, not just those directed at humanity but all such programs. The 3 other species that had been subjected to Council control would be investigated, and any survivors would be offered full restitution, including territory and resources. Second, the Council would pay reparations to humanity for the 23 worlds that had been targeted for extermination. The payments would fund defensive installations and serve as a deterrent against future aggression. Third, and this caused an uproar among the Council members, humanity would be granted permanent seats on the Council with full veto authority over any military action. No species would ever again face the threat of coordinated Council aggression without humanity having a voice in the decision. Fourth, Council military forces would be reduced by 50%, with the demobilized forces subject to monitoring by independent observers including human officers. Fifth, all classified records relating to the 3 species previously subjected to cleansing protocols would be released to human authorities. Humanity would investigate what had happened to those species and ensure appropriate justice was served. Sixth, any species would have the right to refuse Council membership without facing economic sanctions, military threats, or political isolation. The Council would no longer be a mandatory organization but a voluntary association. The terms were harsh but not vindictive. Humanity was not seeking to dominate the galaxy or replace the Council with human authority. They were ensuring that what had almost happened to them could never happen to anyone else. The Council would continue to exist, but it would exist as a forum for cooperation rather than an instrument of control. The Council members debated among themselves. Some argued that accepting these terms would mean the end of Council authority as they had known it. Others pointed out that rejecting them would mean the end of their species entirely. Humanity had demonstrated the capability and willingness to destroy stars. They had weapons that ignored defenses previously thought impenetrable. They had tactics and strategies that had overwhelmed military forces 200 times their size. The vote took 3 hours, In the end, it was unanimous. Every council species accepted humanity's terms in full. They had no choice, but more importantly, many of them had begun to understand that the old galactic order had been built on injustice. 3 species extinct or enslaved simply for being successful. How many more would have followed if humanity had not forced a change? Dr. Jiwoo delivered the closing statement, and her words would be studied by historians for centuries to come. She spoke about the nature of survival and the responsibilities of power. The council had believed they were dealing with children, with primitives who should be grateful for any scrap of dignity they were allowed. They had failed to understand what humanity actually was. Humans were not children. They were survivors of a world that had tried to kill them in every way possible. They had learned to adapt, to innovate, to fight when fighting was necessary, and to cooperate when cooperation served their interests. They had looked into the darkness of their own nature during the Unification Wars, and had chosen to rise above it. But they had never forgotten the lessons learned in that darkness. The Council had tried to force a choice between slavery and extinction on humanity. They had assumed humans would choose slavery because it meant survival. But they had fundamentally misunderstood human psychology. Humans would rather die free than live as slaves. More than that, humans would make sure that anyone trying to enslave them paid a price so terrible that no one would ever attempt it again. Jiwoo spoke about the weapons humanity had used, the terrible things they had done in the name of survival. She did not apologize for them, but she did acknowledge their weight. Humanity had crossed lines that should not be crossed, used weapons that should not exist, and committed acts that would haunt them for generations. They had done these things because the alternative was extinction, but that did not make them easy to live with. Now, she said, the galaxy faced a choice. They could learn from this war and build something better, or they could continue with the same patterns of dominance and submission that had led to this catastrophe. Humanity preferred the former but was prepared for the latter. The weapons that had won this war still existed. The soldiers who had fought it were still ready. Humanity hoped they would never be needed again. But hope was not the same as certainty. The treaty was signed by representatives of every major species in the galaxy. The formal ceremony took 6 hours, with each signature recorded and verified. When it was complete, the Galactic Council as it had existed for 10,000 years was effectively dead. What would replace it remained to be seen. 6 months passed. The immediate aftermath of the war proved almost as challenging as the fighting itself. Human strike teams returned home to mixed receptions. Some were hailed as heroes who had saved humanity from extinction. Others were called war criminals who had committed atrocities. Colonel Bora found herself testifying before 3 different commissions investigating the conduct of Special Operations Forces during the war. She answered every question honestly. Yes, they had assassinated enemy leaders. Yes, they had used tactics that violated council conventions on warfare. Yes, she would do it again if humanity's survival required it. The commission struggled with her answers because they were uncomfortable truths. War was not clean or moral or fair. It was survival taken to its logical extreme. Captain Minji faced similar questions about the weapons she had deployed. Self-replicating nanomachines that consumed ships and crew without distinction, viral agents designed to kill specific species, quantum weapons that defied conventional understanding of cause and effect. She explained that these weapons had been developed during the Unification Wars, preserved against future need, and ultimately used because the alternative was humanity's extinction. The commissions could judge her actions, but they could not change the outcome. Humanity had survived. Dr. Yoon Seo stood before the largest commission, answering questions about Project Dying Sun. She explained the physics of stellar manipulation, the calculations that had gone into the weapon, the safeguards that had been included to give targets time to evacuate. She was asked if she felt guilt for threatening billions of lives. Her answer was simple and devastating. She felt guilt for creating the capability, but she would feel more guilt if humanity had been exterminated because she refused to use it. Admiral Hyo Jin oversaw the partial demobilization of human forces. The Ghost Fleet was scaled back, with 80% of its ships being decommissioned. The remaining 20% were integrated into the regular fleet, a reminder of capabilities that could be reactivated if needed. Strike team personnel were offered the option to return to civilian life or continue serving in reformed special operations divisions. Throughout human space, Memorials were constructed. President Haiwan had ordered that they honor not human casualties, which had been surprisingly light, but the future that humanity had almost lost. Each memorial was different, designed by local communities to reflect their own understanding of what the war had meant. Some were somber reflections on the cost of survival. Others were defiant celebrations of humanity's refusal to submit. The Hravkan home system remained a constant reminder of the war's stakes. Their sun continued its slow destabilization, now calculated to go critical in 70 years. Evacuation efforts had begun immediately, with the Hravkan government desperately trying to relocate billions of people to other worlds. Humanity offered assistance, providing transportation and temporary housing. It was a strange gesture, helping to save the species they had threatened to destroy, but it was important to show that humans could choose mercy even after choosing war. Investigation teams began researching the 3 species that had been subjected to council cleansing protocols. 2 were extinct, their last survivors dying centuries ago in council-controlled reservations. The 3rd still existed as a small population living under heavy restrictions on a minor council world. Ambassador Dai Hyun personally led the diplomatic mission that offered them freedom and restitution. The survivors, numbering barely 10,000, accepted and were relocated to worlds in human space where they could rebuild their civilization. The galaxy watched these developments with growing understanding. Humanity had not gone to war to conquer or dominate. They had fought for survival and then had used their victory to create a more just system. Other younger species began forming defensive alliances with humanity, recognizing that humans had fundamentally changed the power dynamics that had favored elder species for millennia. A year after the war ended, Ambassador Daehyun stood in his office on Earth, looking at the night sky through large windows. Lieutenant Soo-jin, his new aide, entered with reports on council activities. Several elder species were quietly modernizing their military doctrines, studying human tactics and preparing for the possibility of future conflicts. It was both concerning and encouraging. Concerning because it suggested some species still thought in terms of warfare. Encouraging because they were adapting rather than remaining locked in outdated thinking. Soo-jin asked the question that many humans wondered about. Would the peace last? Or would humanity face another threat in the future that would require them to use the terrible weapons they had demonstrated? Daehyun considered his response carefully. The treaty was only as strong as the will to enforce it. Humanity had shown the galaxy 2 faces: the peaceful species that wanted cooperation and friendship, and the terrifying force that would burn the galaxy to survive. The Council had made the mistake of ignoring the first face and provoking the second. As long as the galaxy remembered both faces, there would be peace. But if they forgot, if some species decided that enough time had passed and humanity could be threatened again, then the weapons would come out of storage, and the protocols would be reactivated. Humanity had learned to be peaceful, but they had never forgotten how to be dangerous. That dual nature was both humanity's greatest strength and its greatest burden. He thought about the soldiers who had fought, the scientists who had built weapons of mass destruction, the diplomats who had tried and failed to prevent war. All of them carried the weight of what had been done. The galaxy saw humanity's victory, but humans themselves saw the cost of that victory measured in moral compromises and ethical boundaries crossed. Soo-jin left him to his thoughts. Daehyun looked at the stars and wondered what future generations would make of these events. Would they see humanity as heroes who saved themselves and reformed an unjust system? Or as monsters who had used terrible weapons and threatened genocide to achieve their goals? Perhaps both views were true. Perhaps that was the fundamental nature of humanity, capable of both great good and terrible evil depending on what survival required. The galaxy had learned its lesson. The Council would never again threaten extinction against a member species. Elder races would think twice before trying to dominate younger ones. The balance of power had shifted in ways that could not be undone. But humanity had also learned a lesson. They had discovered just how far they were willing to go to survive, and that knowledge changed them. They could never again think of themselves as purely peaceful or purely good. They were a species that had stared into the abyss, refused to blink, and then used the abyss as a weapon against their enemies. As Dae-hyun finally left his office for the evening, he passed a quote that President Hae-won had ordered inscribed in the entrance of every government building. It was simple and direct, a summary of everything humanity had learned. Humanity offers the open hand of friendship first. But if that hand is rejected, it becomes a fist. The choice is yours. The galaxy had made its choice, pushed humanity to become something terrible, and barely survived the result. Now they lived in a new order, one where humanity stood as an equal among the stars, respected not just for their potential but for their proven willingness to fight for their survival against any odds. It was not the future anyone had wanted, but it was the future they had created together. And it was better than the alternative.